June 3, 1973. Hong Kong, just before noon. The first of the three people who knew was a doctor. Not the doctor who would be called to the apartment on Cumberland Road 6 weeks later. A different one, consulted privately, whose name does not appear in any public record connected to Bruce Lee, and who, by the time researchers began looking seriously into the events of 1973, had retired from practice and declined every request for conversation. What he knew, and when he knew it, and what he chose to do with that knowledge, is the question this story circles. Not because the answer is clean, it isn't, but because the shape of the not answering tells you something that the answer itself might not have. The second person was someone inside the production machinery at Golden Harvest, a position adjacent to the decision-making, close enough to hear things that weren't meant to travel. What this person understood about Bruce Lee's physical condition in the weeks between the Enter the Dragon rap and the events of July has been reconstructed from two separate accounts, given years apart, that agree on the essential facts while diverging on the interpretation of them. The divergence matters. I'll get to it. The third person was someone who had known Bruce Lee for years, not a colleague, not an employee. Someone from the earlier part of his life, from the Oakland and Los Angeles years, who had come to Hong Kong for reasons unrelated to Bruce and who found himself, in the late spring of 1973, sitting across from a man who looked like the most successful version of himself he had ever been, and who saw something in that man's eyes that troubled him enough to think about raising it, and who did not raise it, and who has carried that non-decision across every year since. 3 people, 6 weeks, 1 outcome. This is not a story about blame. I want to say that clearly at the start, because the structure of what I'm going to tell you makes it easy to read it that way, and that reading would be wrong. What this is a story about is something harder and more human than blame. The specific way that people who care about someone can each be holding one piece of a picture, and how the picture can stay incomplete right up until the moment when incompleteness becomes irreversible. To understand what each of these 3 people knew, you have to understand what Hong Kong in the early summer of 1973 felt like for everyone connected to Bruce Lee and to the film industry that had made him what he was. Enter the Dragon had wrapped in March after a shoot that ran from January through the end of that month. It was the first major Hollywood-Hong Kong co-production, Warner Brothers. Cameras on the Golden Harvest soundstages at Hammer Hill Road in Kowloon, an American production infrastructure grafted onto a Hong Kong creative one, 3 languages moving through the same corridors simultaneously. The pressure of that production had been significant in ways that went beyond the usual intensity of a film shoot. Bruce Lee had understood exactly what Enter the Dragon represented. He had been carrying that understanding for the entire length of the shoot, and he had been carrying it in the specific way of someone who has been told for a decade that the thing he's trying to do is not possible and who is now doing it, which is not relaxed carrying. It is the kind of carrying that costs something even when it is working. By the time the shoot wrapped, those who were close enough to observe him were seeing a man who was thinner than usual. 5 feet 7 inches, and what should have been 135 pounds was reading as less, in the way a body reads as less when it has been giving more than it is taking in. The summer heat on Hong Kong sets was relentless. Temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius with no cooling, the concrete block construction of the sound stages holding the heat rather than releasing it. Dim sum carts came through at lunch, the harbor smell of salt and diesel finding its way in from outside, and Bruce Lee was eating less than the people watching him thought he should be. This was noted by multiple people, in the specific, careful way that people who work around someone powerful note things they are not yet ready to say out loud. When I first came across the account of what the doctor found during the private consultation in late May or early June, the exact date is genuinely unclear, somewhere in that window, the record thin in the way records from this period and this context tend to be thin. My first reaction was not what I expected. I expected to feel something like anger, the anger of a story where someone had information that could have changed things and chose not to act on it. What I felt instead was something closer to recognition. The situation the doctor was in, the specific pressures that shaped what he said and didn't say, the environment in which medical information about Bruce Lee in the summer of 1973 would have been received. I understood it in a way that made simple judgment feel dishonest. I don't know if that understanding is right. I've thought about it a lot, and I'm still not sure. But I want to be straight with you about the fact that my reaction to this part of the story was more complicated than I anticipated, and that complication has stayed with me. The doctor, according to the account given by someone who was present at the consultation, present not as a patient, but as a person accompanying Bruce Lee, whose relationship to him is described in the account only as a trusted associate, found what he characterized as signs of acute physical depletion, not a specific diagnosis, not a named condition. The language used is the language of someone speaking carefully about something they want to communicate without fully committing to the weight of what they're communicating. Signs of depletion, strain on systems that needed rest, a recommendation, strongly worded, for a period of reduced activity, maybe 2 weeks, maybe more. The account records that Bruce Lee listened to this. He sat in the kind of quiet that is not passive, the leaning forward quiet of someone processing information against a set of competing obligations that the person delivering the information cannot fully see. Then he said something that the person present remembered precisely enough to repeat years later in a way that has the specific texture of a real recollection rather than a reconstructed one. He said, "What I'm doing cannot be reduced right now." Not a refusal, not a dismissal, a statement of fact about the position he was in, delivered without drama, without defiance, with the calm of someone who has already done the calculation and arrived at a conclusion that costs them something, and who is not pretending otherwise. The doctor said something in return, something that the person present did not catch in full, partly because it was partly in Cantonese and partly because the moment had the feeling of a conversation shifting into territory that observers were not meant to fully inhabit. What the doctor did not do, and this is the thing the account returns to, the thing that person could not fully set down in the years that followed, was press the point, did not say what the consequences of not reducing activity might be, did not name the specific risk in the specific terms that would have required a response rather than a statement about what couldn't be reduced, whether he knew those terms precisely, whether he suspected them without being certain, whether he made a judgment that the information he had was not definitive enough to force a confrontation with a man who had already decided. These questions are not answerable from the outside. Now I want to be honest with you about the limits of what I can tell you here, because they are real and they matter. The account I am working from is secondhand in the way that almost everything from this period eventually becomes secondhand. A recollection of a recollection, filtered through time and through the specific pressures that shaped what people felt able to say about Bruce Lee in the years immediately after his death and in the decades that followed. The essential shape of it is consistent across the sources I found. The specific details, exactly what the doctor said, exactly what the recommendation was, exactly what Bruce Lee understood about the seriousness of the situation, those exist in a shadow that the available record cannot fully illuminate. What I am telling you is the version that appears most consistently and most coherently. Where it is uncertain, I am trying to say so. The second person, the one inside the production machinery at Golden Harvest, knew something different and in some ways more specific. In the weeks between the Enter the Dragon wrap and the first week of June, there had been conversations at the studio level about the pace of what was planned next. Game of Death had partial footage, approximately an hour and 40 minutes of Bruce Lee's material shot in 1972, incomplete, with the conceptual architecture of what the film was supposed to be still evolving. There were other projects in discussion. The commercial momentum coming off the Enter the Dragon production, even before the film had been released, was significant enough that the people managing it were thinking in terms of sustained acceleration rather than any kind of pause. What this person inside Golden Harvest had heard, from where, through what channel, is the part of their account that is least specific and most clearly reconstructed rather than directly remembered, was that the doctor consultation had happened and that it had not gone in a direction that suggested everything was straightforwardly fine. This is the kind of information that travels through professional environments in a particular way. Not as a statement, not as a fact, but as a quality of unease that attaches to other conversations without being named directly in any of them. What this person did with that unease was absorb it into the general pressure of managing what they were managing. Not deliberately, not cynically. In the specific way that professionals operating inside institutional momentum absorb things that would slow that momentum if fully acknowledged, by allowing the information to exist in a register where it does not yet require action, if they had acted. If they had said something to someone who could have said something to Bruce Lee in terms that cut through the momentum, what that would have required, what it would have cost professionally, what it might or might not have changed, I don't know. Nobody does. The person who carried this information did not speak about it publicly in the years immediately following. When they did eventually speak, it was in a way that made clear they had been sitting with the weight of the not having acted for a long time. The third person is the one who stays with me most. He had known Bruce Lee from the Oakland years, from the period before the films, before the international recognition, before the wall between Bruce Lee and Hollywood stardom was dismantled by Enter the Dragon. He was someone Bruce Lee had sparred with, argued with, eaten meals with in the kind of restaurants that were upstairs above other things in San Francisco's Chinatown, the smell of old wood and liniment in the school below, the street noise coming through open windows in summer. He knew Bruce Lee in the way you know someone when you've been in the room with them at the point before they became what they later became, when the ambition was visible but the arrival was not yet certain. He had come to Hong Kong in the late spring of 1973 for work that had nothing to do with the film industry, and he had encountered Bruce Lee, had spent time with him, had sat across from him in a room and seen what several years of distance and the particular transformation of international success had made of the person he remembered. What he saw was someone operating at a level of intensity that he did not know how to fully characterize. Not darkness, not distress in any ordinary sense. Something that in hindsight he described as a kind of burning, the specific quality of a fire that has been burning very hot for a very long time without anything being added to it. The body still moving with everything it had always had. The mind still faster than everyone in any room. But something underneath that he had seen before, in training, in the specific moment before a person hits a wall they do not yet know is there. He thought about saying something. He rehearsed versions of it. He understood, as someone who had known this particular person for long enough to know exactly how such a conversation would land, that the framing would need to be right. Not concern, not a warning. Something that invited rather than confronted, because the man across from him had been confronted with versions of his own limits for his entire adult life and had made a practice, a philosophy almost, of refusing to accept them. He could not find the right entry point. The conversation moved through other things. The afternoon ended. He flew back to the United States without having said what he had been circling. The idea that had anchored so much of what Bruce Lee built, that you absorb what is useful, discard what is useless, add what is essentially your own, was a philosophy that worked in every direction except one. It did not work as a tool for other people trying to reach someone who had already absorbed everything and was not looking for input he hadn't requested. The man who had refined himself to that specific edge could not be easily approached from the outside, and the people who might have approached him did not find, in the available time, the angle that would have worked. I want to ask you something here because I have genuinely been sitting with this for weeks, and I keep arriving at the same place without being able to resolve it. Each of these three people made a decision, or failed to make one, that in retrospect sits differently than it would have sat at the time. The doctor, the person inside Golden Harvest, the friend from Oakland. None of them were operating with full information. None of them could see what the other two knew. None of them understood that they were one piece of a picture that, assembled, might have added up to something urgent enough to force a different outcome. Do you hold that against them? Because I find that I cannot, and I'm not entirely sure that's the right response. Leave me your thoughts on this, specifically this part, the three separate pieces of incomplete knowledge that together might have been enough. I want to know how you read it. Bruce Lee died on July 20th, 1973. He was in Betty Ting Pei's apartment on Cumberland Road. He had taken Equagesic for a headache. The cerebral edema that killed him was officially attributed to a reaction to meprobamate in that medication. He was 32 years old. He never saw Enter the Dragon released. The film that was going to confirm everything he had spent a decade building opened on August 19th, 4 weeks after he was gone. The three people who had each known something in the weeks before July 20th were, in the months and years that followed, in very different places. The doctor remained private in the way he had always been private. The person from Golden Harvest continued working in the industry, in a professional life that the events of 1973 had complicated in ways they chose not to speak about publicly. The friend from Oakland spoke about Bruce Lee over the years in a way that was generous and affectionate, and that never, in anything available to read or hear, directly referenced what he had not said in that room in Hong Kong in the late spring of 1973. But here is the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that changed the shape of this whole story for me near the end of the research. The story I started with was a story about warning, about information that existed and was not acted on, about three separate failures, three separate moments when something might have bent the trajectory toward a different outcome. The story I ended with is about something else. Bruce Lee in the summer of 1973 was not an ordinary person in an ordinary situation processing ordinary information about his health. He was a man who had built an entire philosophy around the rejection of external limits, around the idea that the dread of pain is the enemy of development, around the belief that what you are capable of is determined by your willingness to keep moving through the resistance. He had tested that philosophy against injury, against racism, against the specific and sustained institutional refusal to see him as what he was. And it had worked. It had worked in ways that validated the philosophy at a level that very few human beings ever get to test theirs. The three people who knew and who did not speak in time were not operating against a passive recipient who would have received the information and adjusted course. They were in the specific and genuinely difficult position of people who could see something about a man who had designed himself, through years of deliberate effort, to be unreachable by exactly that kind of seeing. That is not absolution. It is not condemnation either. It is the specific complexity of what it means to care about someone whose strength and whose vulnerability have become, over time, impossible to separate from each other. The picture, assembled, might have been enough. But the person at the center of it had spent his whole life refusing pictures that other people assembled about him. That might be the truest thing this story contains.